Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal during the turbulent week of July 7 through July 11 in Port Charles, a chilling discovery shattered any previous assumptions surrounding the tragic death of Natalia. What was initially believed to be a fatal accident caused by a lethal mix of alcohol and prescription drugs was soon proven to be something far more sinister. The official autopsy report, released by the PCPD, revealed the presence of an untraceable synthetic compound in Natalia's bloodstream, one that had not been prescribed, nor recognized in any standard pharmaceutical registry. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, transforming what had been dismissed as yet another unfortunate overdose into the catalyst of one of the most explosive murder investigations Port Charles had seen in years. Suspicion rapidly shifted away from Natalia's personal demons and landed squarely on a man who had already spent decades under the shadow of the law, Sonny. While Sonny sat isolated in a cold PCPD interrogation room, surrounded by walls of silence and suspicion, Laura and Anna worked frantically to unravel the truth. Every detail of the toxicology report raised more questions than it answered, especially the origins of the foreign compound found in Natalia's body. As speculation mounted in the press and among citizens, the real storm was brewing within Marco, the heartbroken and furious son of Natalia. Sidwell, Marco's father and a longtime nemesis of Sonny, seized the opportunity with ruthless precision. Using the grief and confusion clouding Marco's judgment, Sidwell whispered poisonous words of blame, feeding his son's pain with calculated rage. What began as sorrow quickly curdled into vengeance. Marco, once a quiet and composed figure, became consumed by a thirst for justice twisted into revenge, and Sidwell stood by, not to heal his son, but to weaponize him. The funeral of Natalia became the epicenter of this emotional earthquake. With Sonny still behind bars, stripped of the chance to mourn or defend himself, Marco stood defiantly in the heart of the church. His grief transformed into public condemnation as he pointed his finger at Sonny, declaring him the murderer of his mother. The congregation, filled with friends, family, and onlookers, erupted into chaos. Those once loyal to Sonny began to falter, their support eroded by whispers of doubt and relentless media coverage. His enemies, emboldened by this moment of vulnerability, descended with renewed fervor, turning the narrative against him. For a moment, it seemed as though the very fabric of Sonny's reputation would be torn to shreds by grief-fueled hysteria and carefully planted lies. But fate had not yet closed its chapter on the truth. In the haze of mourning and moral panic, Blaze appeared, cutting through the tension with a calm, determined presence. Once a close acquaintance of Natalia, Blaze had been harboring suspicions from the start. What others chalked up to relapse, she saw as manipulation. What others dismissed as coincidence, she tracked as evidence. And now, she held in her possession a piece of irrefutable proof, a recorded message from Natalia herself. In the recording, Natalia confessed her growing fear of Sidwell and described a recent encounter in which he coerced her into consuming something unknown. Her voice, trembling but clear, painted a picture of desperation, fear, and betrayal, implicating Sidwell as the true architect behind the fatal event. Blaze's revelation struck Port Charles like a thunderclap. The funeral service turned into a tribunal of truth as Blaze played the recording for all to hear. Gasps filled the room. Doubts turned to outrage, not at Sonny, but at the man who had used his son's pain as a weapon. The seeds of hatred Sidwell had planted in Marco now twisted in agony as he heard his mother's own voice cry out from beyond the grave. The betrayal he had so firmly believed came from Sonny had, in fact, come from the man who had raised him. Marco crumbled, and for the first time in days, the tide of public opinion shifted. A community that had begun to splinter around suspicion found itself united again, now determined to seek justice not against Sonny, but for him. Anna immediately reopened the case with new eyes and renewed urgency. A full forensic audit was ordered on Natalia's autopsy process, uncovering glaring irregularities. It wasn't long before a hospital technician confessed under pressure. He had been bribed by Sidwell to alter the toxicology results and contaminate Natalia's samples post-mortem. Sidwell's plan had been meticulous, but not infallible. His need for vengeance had driven him to fabricate a crime, and in doing so, he left behind a trail of corruption and manipulation. His actions didn't just frame Sonny, they desecrated the justice system, jeopardized the integrity of the PCPD, and nearly destroyed his own son. Anna, once skeptical of Sonny's innocence, now emerged as a fierce advocate for clearing his name. She led the charge in dismantling the layers of deception surrounding the case. Press conferences were held. Internal Affairs launched investigations into all those complicit in the falsified autopsy. The courts were forced to reckon with the fallout, as the public demanded transparency and accountability. As the pieces of Sidwell's carefully crafted illusion collapsed, the truth stood tall and undeniable: Sonny had not murdered Natalia. He had tried to help her, even arranging for her safety and new beginning. His greatest crime was trust, in a system that had allowed Sidwell to infiltrate its core. Sonny walked out of PCPD not as a disgraced suspect, but as a vindicated man. Though the scars of accusation would linger, his name had been restored. Blaze was hailed as a hero, not only for defending the memory of Natalia but for saving Marco from being lost to hatred. And Marco, torn between guilt and grief, began a slow and painful journey toward healing, knowing he had nearly destroyed the very man his mother had trusted. In the wake of Sidwell's arrest and the unmasking of his crimes, the city of Port Charles found itself forever changed. The events of that week served as a brutal reminder that evil often hides behind familiar faces and that justice, though delayed, cannot be denied when truth finds its voice. Natalia's death, once believed to be a sad consequence of personal weakness, became a call to action for institutional reform. Sidwell's influence, long feared but tolerated, was now eradicated. The power he once held crumbled under the weight of his own hatred. And in its place rose a renewed belief in accountability, redemption, and the power of truth. For Sonny, the battle was not just about his freedom but about reclaiming the meaning of justice in a world eager to condemn without evidence. And for Port Charles, the reckoning that followed marked not just the end of a tragedy, but the beginning of something stronger. Sonny was released from his cell beneath the dim lights of the PCPD holding facility to the silent awe and emotion of those gathered outside. The air was thick with the weight of vindication. This was not merely a legal clearance, it was a moral restoration. For years, Sonny had been the subject of suspicion, speculation, and endless judgment from both law enforcement and the public. Yet in this moment, he walked out not as a fallen mob figure clinging to shadows, but as a man whose innocence had spoken through the undeniable clarity of truth. There were no words needed. The footage Blaze had exposed, the manipulated evidence unraveled by Anna's investigation, and the confessions of those Sidwell had bribed stood as more powerful testaments than any defense Sonny could have offered. His silence became a symbol, not of guilt, but of dignity reclaimed in the face of orchestrated injustice. The crowd that had once murmured doubts now stood solemn and still, many of them blinking back tears, ashamed of how quickly they had doubted the man who, for better or worse, had long been a protector of Port Charles in ways they barely understood. But for Marco, the son of the woman whose death had been weaponized, the emotional collapse was far more personal and devastating. The moment he heard his mother's voice, the frail, frightened confession she had recorded out of desperation, his world fractured. What he had believed to be righteous anger was exposed as carefully planted rot. He had not been seeking justice for his mother. He had been manipulated into carrying out a vendetta that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. The man he had admired, feared, and obeyed, his own father, had used him as a pawn in a cruel game of revenge. Marco found himself spiraling into a state of psychological disarray. Every memory with Sidwell became a source of doubt. Every decision he had made in the wake of Natalia's death now felt like a betrayal to her legacy. He had almost condemned an innocent man based on a narrative crafted by a master manipulator. The weight of guilt threatened to pull him under completely. It was Blaze, the woman who had once stood at the margins of this storm, who stepped forward, not as a savior, but as someone who understood pain and loss intimately. She found Marco not with judgment, but with empathy. She saw in him the same emptiness that had once consumed her in the aftermath of losing Natalia. Her approach was not forceful or dramatic, it was patient, human. She reminded Marco of who Natalia truly was, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had struggled to escape the control of powerful men all her life, and who had finally tried to start over. Blaze did not try to erase Marco's pain, but she offered him a lens through which he could see it differently. Not as a weapon, but as a path to redemption. Gradually, through quiet conversations and shared memories, a bond formed. What began as mutual mourning became something deeper, a connection forged through the common pursuit of truth and the shared wound of betrayal. Their relationship, once distant and circumstantial, grew into a symbol of healing. Blaze, having fought to preserve Natalia's truth, now helped Marco find his own. He learned to grieve properly, not through blame, but through understanding. He began attending counseling, speaking publicly about the dangers of manipulation and unchecked vengeance. And Blaze stood beside him, not as a guide, but as a companion in recovery. Together, they became the unlikely torchbearers of a moral reckoning far greater than themselves. Natalia's death, once dismissed as the final act of a tragic figure spiraling out of control, was now recognized as the ignition point for a seismic shift in Port Charles. The revelations surrounding her murder exposed not just one man's cruelty, but the systemic rot that had been quietly festering beneath the surface of city politics and law enforcement. Sidwell, once viewed as a cunning but untouchable figure, now faced charges that stretched beyond murder. Evidence tampering, bribery, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. As his trial loomed, more names began to emerge. Financial records, surveillance logs, and leaked testimonies pointed to a wider conspiracy implicating individuals within the city council, the district attorney's office, and even hospital administration. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens demanded transparency. Long-time officials were placed under investigation. Emergency oversight committees were formed. Anna, galvanized by the near destruction of an innocent man's life, spearheaded a task force to root out all those who had colluded, knowingly or unknowingly, with Sidwell's machinations. What began as a personal vendetta had grown into a full-scale cleansing of corrupt power structures that had long operated in the shadows. Sidwell's empire crumbled not just because of the laws he broke, but because of the humanity he betrayed. His own son, the mother of his child, and the very ideals of justice he had sworn to uphold. Through it all, Natalia's legacy transformed. No longer was she seen as a troubled woman defined by past mistakes. She became a symbol, a reminder that no voice, no matter how fragile, should be ignored. Her posthumous courage in recording her fears, her decision to trust Blaze, and her final attempt to reclaim her life became acts of profound defiance. Schools, community centers, and outreach programs began to tell her story as a lesson in vigilance, resilience, and the silent power of truth. Her name, once whispered in pity, was now spoken with reverence. And as for Port Charles, the city itself was forced to confront its conscience. The tragedy became a mirror, reflecting both its darkest vulnerabilities and its capacity for renewal. People learned, painfully but profoundly, that justice must never be assumed. It must be pursued, protected, and sometimes fought for against the very institutions meant to deliver it. In the end, the story of Natalia, Sonny, Marco, Blaze, and even Sidwell, became an epic not only of crime and punishment, but of redemption, awakening, and the enduring battle between corruption and conscience. From the depths of one woman's silenced cry emerged a movement that would forever redefine the boundaries of power, the cost of hatred, and the meaning of truth in Port Charles. In the days that followed the dramatic unraveling of Sidwell's conspiracy, the streets of Port Charles remained heavy with reflection. The city, once consumed by suspicion and whispered accusations, now stood on the edge of collective reckoning. Though many questions remained unanswered, some tied to the deeper web of influence Sidwell had constructed, others merely shadows of a justice system struggling to rebuild, one truth rang out with undeniable clarity. Sonny had emerged from the darkness of slander not as a broken man, but as a figure who refused to bend beneath the weight of manufactured guilt. His silence in captivity, once misinterpreted as evasion, was now recontextualized as quiet strength. He had chosen dignity over desperation, trusting that the truth, however long it took, would eventually claw its way to the surface. And it had. Not through systems that claimed to protect the innocent, but through the unlikeliest of allies and the relentless resilience of those who refused to let lies define reality. Blaze, once an outsider looking in, had become something far greater than a peripheral player in a tragic narrative. She had transformed into a symbol of defiant courage and unwavering commitment to truth. Where others had accepted surface explanations, she had dared to dig deeper. Where the powerful manipulated and deceived, she had stood firmly in clarity and conviction. In exposing the truth about Natalia's murder, Blaze had not only cleared Sonny's name, but had also shattered the illusion of invulnerability that men like Sidwell had cloaked themselves in for far too long. Her name was now spoken alongside words like heroism, integrity, and justice. Schools began to tell her story. Advocacy groups held vigils in Natalia's memory, with Blaze as the guest of honor. Not because she sought recognition, but because her refusal to stay silent in the face of deception had restored hope in a town nearly lost to cynicism. Marco, meanwhile, receded into silence, not the kind born of guilt, but one forged in introspection. He had seen the edge of ruin, had teetered on the brink of becoming a weapon for vengeance rather than a voice for truth. Now, with the fire of misplaced anger extinguished, he turned inward. The betrayal he experienced at the hands of his own father cut deeper than any public embarrassment. But it was in that very pain that he found a chance to heal. Marco began attending therapy sessions. He withdrew from the public eye, avoiding media attention and community speculation, focusing instead on understanding how grief and manipulation had warped his vision. Though the journey ahead was long and riddled with emotional scars, Marco had taken the first steps toward reconciliation. Not with Sidwell, but with himself and the memory of the mother he had almost failed. In time, he began to write, a private journal at first, but eventually a public blog dedicated to exploring how pain, love, and forgiveness can coexist in the most complex ways. Some even speculated that Marco might one day speak publicly about the trauma, perhaps even become an advocate for those manipulated by power under the guise of loyalty. And then there was Natalia. The woman whose life was silenced before it could be redeemed. In death, she had become more powerful than she ever was allowed to be in life. Her tragic end, marked by betrayal and injustice, ultimately lit the fuse that exposed a city's festering underbelly. The secrets she carried, once used to manipulate her, had instead become her legacy of truth. Community leaders began using her story to advocate for stronger protections against coercion, for mental health access, and for transparency in law enforcement procedures. Her name became a rallying cry, not of pity, but of empowerment. For women who had once feared speaking out, for families shattered by institutional failure, Natalia became a beacon of awareness, reminding all of Port Charles that even the most overlooked voice can be the one that shakes the foundations of corruption. Through all of this, Port Charles itself began to awaken. The institutions that had allowed Sidwell to operate unchecked were forced to face public scrutiny. Internal audits, ethics boards, and investigative committees were established. The media, once complicit in fanning the flames of misdirection, now turned a critical eye toward its own role in vilifying the innocent and amplifying the corrupt. The ripple effect extended beyond city limits, as surrounding communities began to question the systems they had long taken for granted. Leaders from all sectors, politics, law, healthcare, were called to account, some choosing to resign, others stepping forward to repair what they had once ignored. There was no going back to the way things were. In the heart of the city, where truth had once been buried under layers of fear and influence, a new kind of conversation emerged. One that asked not how justice had failed, but how it could be rebuilt, more transparent, more humane, and more accountable. A mural of Natalia was commissioned downtown, her image painted not in mourning, but in resolve, eyes forward, as if watching over a community determined never again to let silence replace justice. And so, from the ashes of betrayal and loss, a quiet revolution was born. Sonny returned to his family, forever changed but not defeated. Blaze found her voice echoing louder than ever, not out of pride, but out of purpose. Marco learned that healing did not require forgetting the pain, but learning to live in spite of it. And Natalia, in her absence, taught Port Charles its most important lesson, that justice is not merely a verdict, it is a fight. A fight that requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to believe that even in the darkest of nights, the light of truth will always find its way home. In the end, what began as a tragedy cloaked in deception transformed into a reckoning that forever altered the moral compass of Port Charles. From the twisted betrayal orchestrated by Sidwell, to the haunting death of Natalia, to the wrongful imprisonment of Sonny, and finally to the quiet heroism of Blaze, every thread in this harrowing narrative wove together into a tapestry of justice reclaimed. The shadows that once obscured the truth gave way to a newfound clarity, not because the systems worked as intended, but because individuals refused to let corruption prevail.